Welcome to the second season of the World Universities Debating Championship Distinguished Lecture Series. This season revolves around effective altruism, and all of the lectures are organized in coordination with the Effective Altruism Debating Championship. Today, our speaker is Lewis Bollard. Lewis leads Open Philanthropy strategy from farm animal welfare. Prior to joining Open Philanthropy, he worked as a Policy Advisor and International Liaison to the CEO at the Humane Society of the United States, HSUS. Prior to that, he was a litigation fellow at HSUS, a law student, and an associate consultant at Bain Company. He has a BA from Harvard University in Social Studies and a JD from Yale Law School. Lewis's talk is titled Farm Animal Welfare. It will be followed by a short Q&A. I'm Dan Lab. I'll host the talk. Notes will be in the channel. If you like it, please subscribe to it. Lewis, the stage is yours.
Great. Thank you so much. And thanks for joining. I'm excited to be talking with a group of debaters. As a former debater myself, this is close to my heart. Let me just share the screen and see if I can get the presentation going. Great. So I'm going to be talking today about effective altruism in animals and more broadly about factory farming, and particularly trying to give this something of a debate tilt. So I've kind of oriented it around, first I'm going to cover a few brief arguments against factory farming. What's the case against factory farming? Going into a little bit of detail about the system and a little bit of detail about the trends that we see with factory farming. The second thing I'm going to cover is counter arguments. So going over what are the most common arguments in favor of factory farming against the arguments you're hearing today, and what are some responses to those. And then the third thing that I'll cover in most depth is things that have worked in combating factory farming, interventions that we've seen have been successful so far, and what you can do personally to combat factory farming. So I'm briefly going to show a couple of images here of factory farming. There'll only be 3 of these, so you can turn your head if you don't want to see, but I think it's important because at the core of the argument against factory farming is the reality of what it looks like. These are all photos that I took myself on farms, so that I can assure you they're not doctored in any way. And the 3 core things I want to highlight about factory farming. First is that it deprives animals of their most basic needs. So what you see here is a battery cage system. This is how about 7 billion hens are kept for laying eggs globally. And not only are these hens very closely confined for the space of 1 to 2 years, which is their full lifespan, they're also deprived of things that we know they really need, things they have strong preferences for, like having a nesting box to lay their eggs in, having perches on which to perch, having dust in which to dust bathe. And so this is core to all factory farming systems, is that they've brought the animals down to the most basic biological needs, taken away all of the things that can provide for animals' behavioral needs because they're simply too expensive to provide. The second argument and problem with the animal impacts of factory farming is around the chronic pain it causes. So for a huge number of animals within factory farming, they're constantly suffering from some form of chronic pain. Perhaps the most prevalent case of this is with broiler chickens, the meat chickens, which are different from the layer hens raised for eggs globally. And what you see here is an image I took on a farm in India of a meat chicken that's at about slaughter age. And as you can see, it's already severely lame, having trouble walking. We know from studies that this causes severe pain to have these kind of lame legs. And this is prevalent in the global meat chicken broiler production system for about 10 billion chickens alive at any point in time. It's about 60 billion chickens slaughtered globally because they have such short lifespans. The final piece of animal cruelty that I want to focus on in the final graphic photo is the treatment of animals at slaughter, and particularly the causing of acute pain. And I focused here on fish because fish are the animals by far the most numerous, which are slaughtered without any form of stunning prior to slaughter. So this is true for about 100 billion farmed fish globally, over 1 trillion wild-caught fish. And basically the way they die is either through some combination of suffocation, through being crushed, or asphyxiation. That can take hours. And so this again is an image I took myself. This is the reality for the vast majority of fish killed globally, for over 1 billion fish every day. It's also the reality for a lot of other animals on smaller but still very large scales. So those are all the graphic photos. Here's here's the scale of the problem, because I think it's really important to realize that what you're seeing in those images are not aberrations. They're not one-off events that are occurring to a small number of animals. Instead, what we're seeing is a system that is prevalent on a massive scale globally and is growing rapidly. As you can see here, that there are about 120 billion farm animals alive at any point in time by our best estimates. And the mere fact that we have to estimate is due to how little good data exists and how little attention has been paid to each of these animals. That's about 15 animals alive for every person on the globe at any point in time. About 15 animals confined on factory farms. And as you can see, that's grown massively since the 1960s, far outstripped population growth. Now, there are a couple of trends behind that, and I want to just briefly cover those trends. The first is a massive increase in meat consumption, especially driven by a massive increase in chicken consumption. So what you're seeing here is a graph of the global production of meat by livestock type from 1960 to 2018. And you see steady increases in the number of pigs, has more than doubled, number of cattle and other animals, but you just see a massive increase in the number of chickens. And given chickens are far smaller than other animals, it takes about 200 chickens to get as much meat as from one cow, that results in a massive increase in the number of animals being farmed and slaughtered. The other trend driving this is aquaculture. And so what you see here is that the volume of fish pulled out of the sea peaked around 1990, and that's because we hit the sustainable limits of the oceans. Fishing boats just can't pull more fish out of the sea. But global seafood consumption has skyrocketed at the same time. And the only way that the world's been able to meet that is through aquaculture production, through farmed fish. And so what you see here is a huge increase in the volume of fish being farmed. Again, fish being very small, fish also having long lifespans, being farmed for 1 to 2 years. What we're seeing is that this results in a huge increased number of animals, billions and billions more animals. The final thing to note on the trend here is how this is likely to increase in the future. And so I focused here just on Asia, because this is really where we're going to see the vast majority of growth in meat and seafood consumption in the decades to come. What you see is as countries get richer, this is a common trend everywhere, you see an increase in meat consumption and seafood consumption per capita. But of course, that's compounded massively in a country that has a large population. So if you look at China, if you look at the trajectory of Indonesia, the rest of Asia, what we're going to see is a massive increase in meat and seafood consumption. And all of that additional marginal increase is being met by factory farming. So that brings us, that's the brief case against factory farming. I figure that most of you probably already have some sense of why the system's wrong. And so perhaps the more interesting part then to delve into in a little bit of detail is, what are the common counter arguments? What are the things that could justify what we just saw, which appears to be animal cruelty? Why would this system exist in the first place? And what are, this could be useful for debate too, what are some arguments you could make against it? And I'm going to try and kind of make a stronger version of each of these arguments, start out with the common one and show you maybe how it could be sort of steel man to be a little stronger. So the first argument that you'll often hear is just that animals aren't very smart. Why do we care about them in the first place? And I think the more sophisticated version of this is that we all recognize that there is a huge number of life forms on the planet, and we can't care about the well-being of all of it. Most of us, I assume, are not concerned about the well-being of plants. Most of us probably also feel like we're not that concerned about the well-being of flies or ants. If we recognize there's some kind of continuum, and I think it's implicit for most of us, then for a lot of us, it's going to kind of figure that humans are at the top of that continuum, that animals are further down. And particularly, I've been talking about chickens and fish. I think a lot of people instinctively would say they just don't seem that smart. They don't seem like they're that in need of our kind of our moral concern. And so that's sort of where that argument starts. Well, I think the strongest response to this goes back to one of the earliest thinkers of utilitarianism. This is Jeremy Bentham. And you can read the quote there for yourself. But at the core of it is, first, these animals are often smarter than human infants. And I think most of us don't like the implication that we should have to accept that we just won't care about human infants, or we'll be willing to factory farm human infants. But even if they weren't, even if we could show, for instance, that a farmed fish was not as intelligent as a human infant, why does that matter if we know it can suffer? And so the relevant question is, can they suffer? And there's far more of a scientific debate to get into there, but the short of it is that we feel very confident that mammals, birds, and fish, at the very least, can all suffer. There's a more heated debate about invertebrates, but the mere fact that they can suffer makes these conditions unreasonable. And for what it's worth, even outside of utilitarianism, if you look at virtue ethics, if you look at deontological ethics, most principles will say it's not okay to harm someone simply because they're less smart than you. And if you just think about applying that principle, if you think about that you decided that intelligence was going to be the basis of your moral concern for others, it has some really troubling implications in terms of how we treat children, for starters, but obviously other members of society. And so that argument really kind of seems to fall down on that basis. The second argument is that we don't actually know that the animals suffer. So you'll often hear this from industry, that the mere assertion that I just made of those animals in those photos that they're suffering is an assertion. I don't know what those hens are thinking or feeling. I don't know what those fish are feeling. It's true that there's a degree of projection going on here. And so perhaps the more kind of sophisticated version of this argument is just to say that there is a huge degree of anthropomorphism that's going on in these kind of arguments, where I'm projecting onto these animals what I would feel in a cage. I'm projecting onto them what I would feel in that situation. And perhaps that's not the appropriate thing to do. Perhaps given animals are completely different beings, they experience such different lives, it doesn't make sense to think in those terms. Here, I think, is the most potent response to this, is there's now been a field of scientific study trying to work out how can we test from the animal's perspective what they're actually feeling. And I'm directing you just to one study here, but there's a whole genre of these. In this particular study, they took some of those broiler chickens, ones I showed you earlier that were lame, and they said, for those lame birds, will they self-select feed that's been laced with pain relief? And then they took other birds that weren't lame and said, will they select it? And what they found was that the lame birds were significantly more likely to choose the feed with pain relief. So in other words, these birds are showing us directly that they're in pain. They're choosing something that's going to relieve that pain. And I think these kind of studies are really important, because although I think it is intuitive to most of us that being lame would be painful, it also is easy for us to get in a position of just assuming that's true across species. We now have these kind of studies showing that the animals themselves can indicate this. The next counter argument is that nature's really cruel. And so this is sometimes something that you'll hear industry say is look, like, yeah, we keep our animals cooped up in barns, but at least we provide them with shelter. We protect them from predators. We keep the temperatures within reasonable ranges. Nature can be a horrible, horrible place. And I think the fundamental problem with that is just, so what? So I've shown here, this is just an image of a factory farm from the air. To build this kind of contraption, to set animals up in this, is not an alternative to nature. It's not like each one of these pigs would otherwise be out in nature vulnerable to predators. And my suspicion is most people would probably think they'd be better off in that situation anyway, but that's really not the point. The point is they're bringing each of these animals in each of these barns into existence for the mere fact of factory farming them. And so the question should not be, would they be better off in the wild? The question should be, are they living lives worth living? Is this environment an environment in which they can live a life that is worth living in the first place? And I think most people's basic instinct on that is no, that they're really not living those kinds of lives. Next counter argument is that farmers love their animals. And I included here, this is the National Pig Farmer of the Year from the United States of 2019. As you can see, he loves this piglet. I think the more sophisticated version of this argument is perhaps that farmers are incentivized to care for their animals. So it's certainly true that if you're a farmer and you're trying to produce a whole lot of meat, you're trying to bring a whole lot of animals to slaughter, you don't want them all to die. You don't want your animals to all get sick. You would rather have those animals make it healthy and in decent condition to slaughter, because that's how you make money. So I think the response to this, and this, by the way, is a video from the same source. This is also from the National Pig Farms. This is how they are showing their own facilities. This is not something from animal activists. this is what the system looks like. And first of all, what you see is that it doesn't matter whether the farmer cares or not. This is the farm, this is the system that is economically efficient. It's not about their intent, it's about the result. But the second thing is that the incentive here, when you've got a farm and a barn this large, is not the well-being of any individual animal. The incentive is the well-being of the whole and the overall efficiency. And if it's more efficient to raise 100 pigs and let 30 of them die prior to slaughter than to raise 50 pigs and have them all survive to slaughter, farmers will raise the 100 pigs and let 30 of them die. And that's what we see across these systems repeatedly, is that what's good for efficiency at the total level is not necessarily what's right for the well-being of an animal on the individual level. The other important point here is that you can keep animals alive in terrible conditions. We know this from humans too, that you can keep humans alive in terrible conditions. And so the incentive that exists is to keep the animal alive. The incentive that exists is not to provide it with any particular level of well-being. The fifth counter-argument you'll hear is that we need cheap meat to feed the world. And I included here an image of a carnivore because it's true that he does need meat to survive. And I think this is a very good argument if you're a lion. The problem when we look globally is that cheap meat is not feeding the world. So what you see from this chart is the global population and the portions of recommended protein requirements that are being met by plant-based protein and animal-based protein. And what you can see, it's true that in the US and Canada, and to a lesser degree in the European Union, Brazil, a few OECD nations, we are very dependent on animal-based protein. That's simply not true globally. Most of the world is basically getting enough protein from plant-based protein sources. So the idea that animal protein is absolutely core to feeding the world, that it's absolutely core, for instance, to a country like India getting its protein needs, or it's core to Africa getting its protein needs, this isn't backed up with what we see in the evidence of what people are currently eating, what's currently providing sufficient protein. The next counter-argument you'll hear is that factory farming can actually spare the environment. And this might seem a little absurd to people who are sort of well-versed in the environmental arguments against factory farming. But I think the strongest argument here is that, look, if you accept the premise that we need to eat this much meat, that the world needs more meat, then the most efficient way to produce it is in factory farms. And if that's the most efficient way, that could also be the best for the environment. It could be the best for the environment to have a relatively small amount of space being used with a lot of animals in that confined space to prevent this from being something that kind of takes over all of the wilderness and all of the environment. I think the problem with that argument is that fundamental premise that we need huge volumes of meat in the first place. So what this chart here shows is a couple of different environmental metrics by which you can look at different animal products and different plant-based products in terms of their land use, their freshwater consumption, and their greenhouse gas emissions. And what you see is that the animal products consistently do worse across all of those key metrics. And I think it's important, by the way, to look not just at greenhouse gas emissions, on which cattle and beef are particularly terrible, but to also look at things like water consumption, on which farmed fish look terrible, and chicken are pretty bad too. And so what you see is that although it can be true in a very narrow sense, that if you're trying to get a huge volume of meat, it might be somewhat environmentally better to do that in a factory farming system than an extensive system. That doesn't mean that the premise that we need a huge volume of meat and never need ever increasing volumes of meat is correct or is justified. The final counter-argument you might hear is that I only eat meat from humane farms, or indeed that the world could just have humane farms. And the first thing I want to note about this argument is that it's a huge concession. So the vast majority of meat, and this here is from the Sentience Institute, doing an estimate of what percentage of American farm animals are not kept in factory farms. The vast majority of meat globally is being kept in factory farms. So to say we only will go with humane meat, and this is a common sort of turn you might see in a debate on this, is to say we're only willing to defend less than 1% of the system. We're only willing to defend less than 1% of what currently exists. People will still get in huge debates, and I could go into all kinds of detail about whether this humane farming system is really humane, whether it meets these standards and so on. I think the far more important point is just that this isn't scalable at the level of current meat consumption. So yes, it could be true that you could have an animal, a farm with an animal living a life worth living, and people have an ethical debate about whether that's justifiable in that case or not. But it's really, for the most part, a thought experiment. The vast majority of meat production relies on factory farming, and it's only in a world in which we eat something like 99% less meat this would be a really viable debate that we could actually have. So my basic point here is that if you think the only part of animal farming that's defensible is humane farming, then you're basically in favor of almost all the same things that people who are fighting factory farming are in favor of. You're in favor of getting rid of factory farms, you're in favor of massively reducing meat consumption, massively promoting alternatives. It's just not clear that this argument gets you a very long way. So finally, I want to talk through a couple of interventions that have worked in fighting factory farming and alleviating the harms of factory farming, and some things that you as an individual can do if you're so motivated to take on factory farming. So the first thing I want to point attention to are corporate campaigns that have been very successful in getting companies to get rid of some of the worst abuses in factory farming. So what you see with this chart is, on the y-axis, we have millions of animals covered by corporate pledges from major corporations, and on the x-axis, the years. And then I've thrown on there some brands that made major commitments over the years, and you can see at the same time the number of hens in the US that are going to be covered, and the number of hens internationally covered. And what you see is, through these campaigns, and particularly through pledges from companies like McDonald's and Walmart and Tesco, we're seeing hundreds of millions of animals already who will be put into better conditions, or already huge numbers of these animals out of cages, out of some of the worst conditions in factory farming. This is a chart that shows the companies, just the impact that each of these companies could have. You can see on the bottom, the market share of US eggs. Each of these companies accounts for the % on cage-free they are on the y-axis. And you see, for instance, Costco, which is now over 90% cage-free. 8 million hens is more than the number of hens in most countries globally. So just this one US retailer making this pledge in response to a major campaign from animal advocates has resulted in a bigger change for hens already than as if a country like New Zealand had banned cages entirely. So that's really the scale that you can have with these kind of corporate pledges. Another related route is pursuing legislative reforms. And in the US, the most fruitful avenue of legislative reform on this has been ballot measures. And so you see here a headline about Proposition 12, which was a ballot measure to ban battery cages, gestation crates, and veal crates, and the sale of meat and eggs from animals that have been kept in those systems across California. This passed with over 60% of the vote. And what you see is a market in California with 40 million people immediately covered by a standard that is stricter than just about any other farm animal welfare law in the world. And here is just one way in which you see the cumulative results of these corporate and legislative efforts within the United States. You can see here the percentage of US hens in cage-free housing. In 2015, just 6% of US hens were out of cages. In the most recent data, that's now up to 26% of hens are out of cages, really entirely due to the advocacy of farm animal advocates in pushing corporations, pushing legislators to get rid of cage systems. And now advocates are moving on to new issues. So this was last year a major commitment from KFC across Europe to get rid of the worst abuses of meat chickens, including the most abusive breeds that cause the kind of lameness I was showing earlier, including overcrowding, including inhumane slaughter conditions. And advocates have now been working globally for similar commitments on broiler chickens. At the same time, advocates are pushing globally for cage-free pledges, and particularly pushing multinationals. And so I highlighted here just 3 major commitments over the last couple of years globally. So Carrefour in Taiwan, Tesco, Lotus, the biggest retailer in Thailand, and Walmart in Brazil, all making major pledges to get rid of cages in those countries. And so what we're seeing is a globalization of this corporate progress on farm animal welfare. A few other things that I wanted to highlight. This is a graphic from the European Union's new farm to fork strategy, which is part of the Green New Deal in Europe that was unveiled this summer. And what's exciting with the farm to fork strategy is it's put both farm animal welfare forefront under sustainable food production, but also promoting alternative proteins. And I think this is really an example of advocates' sustained engagement, particularly around farm policy, and seeing that start to pay off in terms of reforms. Another example here is on plant-based meat. This is an ad for the new Beyond Meat offerings at Pizza Hut in China. And what we've seen over the last few years is a huge explosion of interest in plant-based meat globally. And this, again, is somewhere where there's huge potential to displace existing meat products on the market. Here, I wanted to draw attention to two movies that have had a particular impact. And this here you see is Google Trends data. I took the topic of a plant-based diet and then put it next to two movies, What the Health, which was actually released in late 2017, and then Game Changers, which was released in 2020, despite what it says there. And what you can see on the bottom is when those movies were released, you saw a huge spike in interest for plant-based diets. So again, the kind of things that are moving the needle on this, each of these movies, which were largely funded and produced by people who are passionate about helping end factory farming and advancing plant-based diets, having a real impact on how people at least are aware of and thinking about plant-based diets. And then draw attention to fish. So this is a campaign by Eurogroup for Animals. They've been running major petitions to get the European Union to take more seriously the well-being of fish, which we talked about earlier. This is a global trend of companies, of legislative progress, of certifiers taking on fish welfare. It's something we've started to see major progress just in the last few years. Finally, I wanted to just draw your attention to a couple of helpful resources for doing more good for animals with your own career and your own resources. So this is a new group called Animal Advocacy Careers, and I recommend checking out its resources, particularly if you might be interested in working on factory farming as an issue or working to help animals. They offer advice calls, they have profiles on skills. I think they're going to have a job listing. They're going to have a bunch of materials that are relevant to this. And as you can see here, they really focus on not just how can you get involved, but how can you have the most impact. So this is kind of core to the effective altruism approach, is thinking not just in terms of, how can I be a part of this movement? How can I feel good about things? But what are the roles where you could have an outsized impact, particularly applying the skills that you currently have? And so I encourage you to start with this website if you are interested in potentially going to work in the movement yourself. If you're not ready to work in the movement, but you're ready to volunteer, there are a number of major organizations that have exciting volunteer opportunities. This is the Humane League. They're a group that has been at the leader of the corporate campaigns that I just mentioned, has also been leading and building up grassroots mobilization globally. And you can see here an opportunity to volunteer with them, to help on campus outreach, to help with corporate campaigns, to help with all kinds of efforts they're engaged with. The other thing you can think about if you have the resources is donating to help animal groups. There are a lot of people within effective altruism in particular who make a commitment to give away a certain percentage of what they make over their career. So it's very common, for instance, for people to pledge to give 10% of their income over time, which is something that I think is particularly powerful to make as a pledge early in your career. So at a point where 10% really doesn't account for much money at all. Because I think what we see is that for a lot of people, once you get that habit ingrained, once you get the habit of giving a certain amount, it's much easier to maintain that than it is to go back and start giving that amount when you have more money later on, when it's potentially more impactful. What you see here is one place you can start in looking at potential options for groups to give to. This is Animal Charity Evaluators. They're an effective altruism organization that evaluates effective animal charities. And you can see here there are 4 top charities: the Albert Schweitzer Foundation in Germany, Anima in Denmark, the Good Food Institute globally, and the Humane League globally as well. And you can read reviews on them, you can read reviews of other organizations, and you can see which organization seems most compelling to you to start donating to. That's the presentation. I welcome your questions. You're also, if you're interested in hearing more of the same or analyses on these questions, I have a newsletter that has this very unuser-friendly URL where you can sign up, or you can follow me on Twitter where I have similar analyses. So yeah, I look forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you for the highly informative lecture. Before opening the floor for questions, I'll ask a few things that are probably of high interest to our audience. Do you mind sharing how you got involved in the topic in the first place?
Yeah, totally. So when I was a teenager, or I guess kind of still a kid, I learned about global poverty, and you know, as probably for a lot of people kind of learning about global poverty, it's a kind of shocking revelation if you didn't grow up around it, that there is such a scale of suffering, that there's such a scale of deprivation globally, and that so little's being done about it. And so I kind of at that time sort of decided, hey, this is the issue that I need to work on. But I think that really kind of planted in my head the thought of trying to do the most good and trying to find an issue where I could have a real impact. And I then just came across factory farming. It was a couple of I think a couple of online videos. I walked into a live animal market in Vietnam, a number of different experiences. Ended up reading Animal Liberation by Peter Singer and a couple of other books, and kind of collectively came to see this was also a terrible moral failing of our society, but one that was even more ignored than global poverty. So I really kind of saw that where on global poverty, thankfully there were a lot of people working on it. On factory farming, there were very few people working on it. And by contrast, the solutions seemed easier. It seemed like at the core of the problem was not governance hurdles or other kind of systemic challenges, but just that it's slightly cheaper to treat animals worse. And so at that point, I kind of realized this was a unique opportunity for me to have an impact in alleviating animal suffering and yeah, changing things. And so from there, kind of decided I wanted to work on factory farming and have sort of slowly worked my way to my current role where I do philanthropy on the issue.
It's very interesting. Because you have an audience of debaters and you have a background in debating as well, do you mind sharing if debating had any role in shaping your opinions on how you approach these kinds of problems?
Yeah, I think it definitely did. So I mean, yeah, I've been debating since I was a kid in school and did it right through university. And so it was pretty core to my identity and what I did. And I think there were a couple of things about debate. I mean, one is that it pushes you to think analytically. So I think, you know, there are a lot of people who sort of perhaps happy on a lot of issues, not diving into them, not thinking about the different arguments back and forth, and debate, you know, really doesn't allow you to think that way. And in fact, I remember one of the first things I did after I became concerned about factory farming was I sought out everything I could defending factory farming. So I bought a number of books that were like trying to defend the arguments and so on. And the main thing I was shocked about was just how little there was out there. I mean, I think to me, one of the most compelling things was that there were very few people even trying to defend the system. And most of all of the philosophical arguments I found would start out by saying, clearly factory farming is indefensible. I'm just going to defend, you know, eating meat from more humane sources. Like that's the, and so realizing that was kind of the state of argumentation, I think was especially persuasive. I also think that debate lends itself to a more effective altruist approach to things. I think that thinking, again, kind of analytically, thinking in terms of numbers, thinking on a global basis, is more likely to make you think of how do we have the biggest impact on this situation? How can we affect things at scale? Rather than to settle for, you know, I think that there are kind of other strands of thoughts or activities that lead you to just focus as locally as possible. But I think, you know, one thing I loved about debate is that I always had far more of a global orientation, far more of a kind of philosophical orientation, rather than just, you know, what do I do in my day-to-day actions?
So your background is in law as well, which is very common amongst debaters. But do you think that people who are passionate about working in animal advocacy can also come from different fields, and if what is relevant to this kind of work in your mind?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's funny. I went to law school in part because I thought that'd be a good way to factory farming, but also in large part just because having done debate for so long, it was like everyone I knew was going to law school, and that was just the obvious thing. And I think that's certainly true globally. I mean, there were a lot of lawyers in the animal movement and in the farm animal movement, and I think it's a really, that's a really useful skill set in terms of thinking about legislation, litigation, obviously, even with things like corporate policy, which look similar to legislative policy. But I definitely don't think it's critical to this field. And if anything, I would say I generally try and discourage people from going to law school unless they're really sure. I think it varies a little bit based on the country you're in. In the US, law school is a postgraduate thing, and so it's 3 years plus a ton of money. Whereas if you can do it as an undergraduate degree, like you can in New Zealand, the UK, Australia, or elsewhere, I think it's a better bet, particularly if the government's paying. But I think that, I would say in general, I always encourage people to think, like, what are your skills and inclinations? So just because everyone around you is going to law school, like, that's not a good reason. And instead thinking, if you're really good at business, or what are the kind of operations roles you might be able to help in? If you're really good at making money, do you want to earn to give and make money and give that to effective groups? So thinking about what are each of the different skills you have and what you're going to be inclined toward and find interesting, I think is probably the most important question.
Looking back, do you think there is something that you could have done that would have placed you in a better position in order to further promote the case against factory farming right now?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's funny, the way things have turned out has sort of been serendipitous, and I'm really fortunate for the position I'm in now, where I get to direct resources toward fighting factory farming and trying to put it to the best use. So it's hard to say how things might have gone differently if I hadn't gone this path. But I think, one thing that one field that I think is very exciting that my kind of path didn't lend itself to is the field of alternative proteins. And so, I think one thing I would say to people who are interested in the scientific side, for instance, is like there's going to be huge need for scientists working on alternative proteins. There's huge need for people with top business expertise and top finance expertise. So I think I don't regret not going one of those routes, but I can definitely see other routes whereby my impact might be greater long term if I hadn't gone this one. So I think in general, one of the sort of nerve-wracking things in the space, but also exciting, is that there are so many different potential paths to easing animal suffering, eliminating factory farming, that it's really hard for me to say right now which of those paths is going to be most promising. And that's where I think people should devote a lot of thought to this themselves, and also consider exploring a few different paths. If you have that flexibility, if you have the risk tolerance and the ability to do that, then I think that's often a great way to see where you can have the most impact.
I have tons more questions, but I'm certain that I've asked enough, and I'm certain that there are people here who want to also engage with the content of the lecture itself. So let's open the floor for questions. So just please raise your hand, and I'll just moderate. So whomever wants to start, feel free. Sean, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for that. So I'm just curious. I find the ethical case to be very persuasive. Mm-hmm. But I'm curious if, based on your experience or the data that's available, what arguments tend to be more persuasive in flipping people, or does it depend on the audience as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it depends a lot on the audience. I think that it also depends on what you're trying to persuade people of. So, I would say, for instance, that a lot of people, if the goal is just for them to eat less meat or to eat plant-based or something, then maybe health arguments are going to be more persuasive. I deliberately shy away from those arguments, because my goal is not just to get people to eat less meat. I think it's really important that we build up a movement globally focused on the plight of animals. And I think the health arguments often lead people to unintended places, like eating chicken and fish instead of beef. And I think it's a similar story with the environmental arguments, which can obviously be very persuasive to some people. But again, I worry that they're not building political concern, building movement concern about the plight of animals, and as a result could result in kind of compromise solutions that, well, good for the environment are not good for animals. So within the animal arguments, I mean, I think the heartening thing to me is that what we see with surveys globally is that basically everyone says, like, then they don't support cruelty to animals. Like, everyone seems to, you know, this isn't like a Western value. There are surveys in China and India globally showing that this is a generally endorsed principle, that you shouldn't torture animals. And I think when most people see the way that animals are treated on factory farms, they agree with the premise that it's torture. I think the challenge is that it's just a very low salience issue for most people, that for most people, they either aren't even aware of it, or if they are aware of it, it's just something in the back of their mind, and it's not something that they want to transform their life over. And so I think the biggest challenge for us is making it a more salient issue. And so, you know, whether that's, so one thing I think can be really valuable is just having sustained conversations on the topic, just having people engage with the topic. I mean, I can actually tell you from the few times that I've sort of persuaded people to on a one-on-one basis to become more interested in this issue, and it tends to be that I had a discussion and that got them thinking, and then that got them to read a book, and you know, once they kind of went down that path, they became much more engaged. So yeah, I would say rather than you know, any sort of one argument, a lot of it is about discussions and just getting people to think about the topic, because yeah, my experience has been it's pretty hard to engage deeply with this topic and come away thinking that factory farming is okay.
It's a great answer. So let's move on to the next question. Bollard, go ahead.
Okay, I'll have a few. I'll start with one first. Okay, so I guess the first one was you were talking about some of the advocacy related to getting companies to commit to using, you know, less cruel forms of animal farming. I guess my question is, what forms of advocacy have you seen being more effective? I know Peter gets a lot of hate, but I've also read a lot of stuff that, like, Peter is actually quite effective in getting, you know, animal welfare standards up in factory farming. So what are your takes on that?
Yeah, good question. So I think that for companies that it varies, but there are two broad approaches that advocates take. The first approach is working cooperatively with companies to help them implement new policies. And there are some companies where, you know, there are people internally who want to do the right thing, and a lot of it is about making sure they're educated on the issues and making sure that they have the ability to implement the reforms and they know how to do it. Obviously, that is not all companies. And so for companies that approach doesn't work with, it does tend to be, yeah, public-facing, hard-hitting campaigns. And I think the key to those campaigns where they succeed is combining very reasonable ask. So for instance, in this case, you know, just stopping the use of caged eggs with sort of unreasonable tactics and a willingness to you know, be a real nuisance, because I think it's true that the only way to kind of break through this bubble from the company's perspective, they would just love silence. Like, they would just love, like, for this to not be a news story, for no one to be asking about it, because silence is really good for the status quo. And so the only way for that to change is where there is some noise, and whether that's online protests, whether that was, you know, the pre-COVID era, lots of in-person protests, things that attract media attention, things that attract the executive's attention, things that, yeah, really get people's faces about stuff. I don't think it needs to be aggressive in the sense that I don't think there's any value to, you know, alienating people, but it needs to be out there enough that it does draw attention.
Thank you for the answer. I think Mubat had more, but we'll go Ido and then we'll go back. Yeah, Ido, go ahead.
Thanks. So you've made two claims before. The first of which is that like less than 1% of the meat is cage-free today. And the second is that like 25% of it is already not factory farmed in the US. So I guess there are like sort of steps between factory farming and cage-free. What are those steps and how much it matters that specifically the first one of factory farming is being changed today? Like how much of the harm is reduced because of that?
Yeah, good question. So to clarify, I'm treating even cage-free systems as a form of factory farming, and you know, that's something people could debate. So my kind of general definition of factory farming is a system where the animals are permanently indoors. That's not to say you can have systems where the animals have some access to the outdoors and it's terrible, and you can, for that matter, have systems where the animals are entirely indoors and they might have good welfare. So it's a rough proxy, and you know, one of the challenges with only supporting humane farming is going into all of those details and working out, did this farm, you know, what exact conditions were the animals kept in this farm and so on. But the broad claim with cage-free is that, well, still a form of factory farming, it's one that causes a lot less suffering. So although, and you know, if you look, you can sort of Google online images of indoor cage-free facilities, which is what most cage-free production is, they're still very crowded, and it's far from natural or ideal conditions for a hen. What is, you know, the claim I make is just that it's a lot less bad than being cooped up in a cage, and that they have a lot of things that matter to them, like nesting boxes and perches and the ability to dust bathe. But yeah, more broadly, I would say that although it's true, so in the US, yeah, less than 1% have access to the outdoors, with the exception, it should be noted, of beef cattle, which are mostly outdoors, along with sheep actually too, but have their own issues that we could go into more detail if you're interested. So yeah, it's true that there are exceptions to this, and in general, factory farming is continuum. Is that, you know, there are the worst systems and there are the less bad systems and so on.
Thank you for the answer. Yeah, Amira, go ahead.
So I guess my question is a little bit long. I guess just as the initial part is, as more people turn to plant-based diets, like the demand for these protein alternatives have significantly increased, and there are many reports saying how this mass demand has increased poor working conditions, land spaces, causing displacements of animals, and many of these other trickle-down harms. I guess my question is, given that suffering is the metric, do you recommend any resources, or rather, how can we best act in line with effective altruism when trying to convert to veganism without contributing to all these other harms that may arise?
I see. So sorry, just to clarify, the first part was about the harms that plant-based alternatives can cause as well. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, it's an interesting question, and as you say, I think that I like how you framed it in terms of the metric of reducing suffering, because you know, I think one misconception around plant-based alternatives or veganism or anything is that they're harm-free, that there is no harm, and there is harm to every way we produce food, whether that is you know, harm to mice caught up in combine harvesters, or whether it's you know, all kinds of other harm. And so yeah, the goal is always to limit that. I think one thing, you know, one basic thing is that in terms of resource use, plant-based alternatives tend to use far fewer resources, and including far fewer grains. So, you know, even if you just look, for instance, at harm to animals living in fields, or harm to nature from planting crops, most animals take many times their body weights in crop they need to be fed to convert into meat, whereas plant-based meat can be converted closer to 1-to-1. So, even if that's the concern, you can reduce suffering by switching to plant-based alternatives generally. But I would say within plant-based alternatives, per your question, there are differences. So I think, for instance, on environmental grounds, I think like oat milk is better than almond milk. Soy milk is better than almond milk for that matter too. So yeah, almonds are probably something to, relatively steer clear of. I think that, if you're so inclined, the kind of legumes and like whole plant proteins tend to be the least resource intensive. I tend to not, promote that too much, because I think for a lot of people, the idea of just eating lentils and oats is not very appealing. And I think in general, there is this real like step change of, just in terms of suffering caused by all forms of animal production to plant-based alternatives. And within that, we're talking about relatively small distinctions. But yeah, I think there are distinctions there. And, I would say, to just kind of, probably the best thing is just to Google each of those products. You can, if you Google almond milk or almonds, you'll find a lot about various issues. If you Google legumes and things, you'll find more positive stuff.
Thank you for the answer. Next question. Yeah, Bobbard, go ahead.
Okay, second. If I get a chance, I'll ask a third one. Okay, so I actually, I've seen, and again, you can correct me if this is wrong, but I think based on your presentation, this is true as well, which is that there is expected that there's going to be a huge surge of demand for meat from rising economies, particularly as more people become middle class and above in countries such as India and China. And I suppose my question is there any advocacy efforts specifically directed towards that, or do you have like any thoughts on how to sort of not let that happen and like stop that trajectory basically?
Yeah, totally. No, it's a good question. It's very true that there is a trajectory in countries as they get richer toward eating more meat, and the impact will be most felt in the largest nations in Asia just because of their scale. I think the most exciting thing on that front is first the rise of plant-based protein alternatives in those countries. So I mentioned Beyond Meat in China. There are now a whole bunch of new plant-based meat companies in China, and a whole bunch of new other alternative proteins there. The other thing is recognizing that each of these cultures has a strong history of alternatives to meat. So if you look at India, obviously both a history of vegetarianism, but also a history of lots of great pulses and other plant-based alternatives. In China, tofu, seitan, they invented meat substitutes. And I think across Asian cuisine, one thing I've sort of sensed, and this is just from traveling, is that there's much more comfort with plant-based things sitting alongside meat, and meat not necessarily being the whole of the plate. I think in the US you're more likely to get like a huge chunk of chicken or steak or whatever it is, and much more likely in China to get a dish that has tofu and some pork and something else. And I actually think that's a really positive thing from this perspective, that a lot of what has made Western diets so destructive is the feeling that meat needs to be at the center of the meal for 3 meals a day. And so I think a lot of the time the goal should be less, can people all go vegan, but more, what does a smaller amount of meat in each meal look like? As I say, I think that East Asian, South Asian cuisines are quite good for that. And so a lot of it is just preventing the ever greater expansion of KFC and all the kind of Western food trends.
Thank you for the answer. Any other questions? So I'll ask one and then we'll go back to you, Bobbard. So just because we're a group of debaters, I have the need to be contrarian and ask. So you mentioned flies in the beginning of the lecture, and there are some animals that are obviously probably can feel significantly less amount of pain compared to others. Do you think that some animal consumption is an ethical thing to do? And if you're uncertain, what would cause you to think that it's an ethical thing to do?
So for myself, I don't consume animals. I think that the by far the greatest problem is factory farming and the scale of suffering and the scale of animals involved. I think that the philosophical debate of can humane meat be ethical and so on is a really interesting one, but as I kind of emphasize, I think it's for almost everyone a theoretical one, and I've never actually met someone who manages to only eat humane meat, because it's just incredibly hard. It basically forces you to be a vegan, except for a small amount of the time when you can go to a farm and source things yourself. So yeah, I guess on the can meat consumption be ethical, I think it's probably a longer debate to be held. In terms of, sorry, do you want to repeat the part about the flies? I missed that.
Yeah, so I'm just asking, because insect consumption or fly consumption, do you think that there are some kinds of animals that can be grown in an ethical manner for the consumption of humans?
I see. Yeah, so I think there's also a fascinating field of research around which animals are conscious and what do they feel. And the short answer is we don't know for a huge number of animals. Once we get down from, saying from mammals and birds and fish, I think we can be pretty confident. But with insects, I think we still don't know. And in that situation, given the scale involved, the number of insects you need to eat a meal of insects, I'm certainly would be inclined not to. I think it's possible one day that we work out that insects aren't conscious. I hope that's true, given the scale of insects involved. But yeah, for now, I think we don't know. And I think just given the scale involved, whether you believe in a precautionary principle or whether you just think in expected value terms, I think either way, the idea of consuming thousands of insects doesn't look that great.
So Mubat, you wanted to ask another question?
Okay, I suppose, okay, so this is going to be a bit not straightforward. So when we discuss with people on, going plant-based and so on and so forth, I guess it's less about the foundation, right? It's not necessarily that the arguments don't consume them, don't convince them, but rather that perhaps for people, there's a lot of culture and there are aspects of life that are basically intertwined with meat, right? So it's it's everything, right? It's whether or not you have religious practices, whether your grandma makes a soup, or nowadays it's it's part of your culture, but I guess there's also a promotion of this culture, right? There's a thing which is that if you go out and you have a steak, you take a picture of it, you put it on Instagram. So it's it's a positive reinforcement of that culture that happens as well. And I'm not sure because I've been thinking about that positive reinforcement because I'm on Instagram all the time. And I guess my question is there any effort in terms of trying to, attack that cultural aspect of it? Because ultimately, if people are if their life is surrounded by a particular culture, maybe it's the roof that matters more than the foundation of their argument. Does that make sense? And is there any effort to sort of
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, I've definitely come to increasingly believe that a lot of the arguments we make are more rationalizations for what culturally or socially we are kind of informed to do. And so I think it makes a lot of sense to think about how do you change that culture? How do you change those social pressures? And I think a couple of things that seem like they've had some impact on that. One is documentaries. I think for a lot of people, documentaries on factory farming have had a real impact. Another is where influencers, whether on social media or influential people in society, have talked out about, have spoken out about factory farming. So, one example is Yuval Noah Harari, in each of his kind of best-selling books has a few pages about how terrible factory farming is. And I think that's really powerful. I mean, I think that kind of thing of people seeing that this figure they respect on other grounds is deeply concerned about this and treats it as important enough to have several pages in his book is really valuable. So yeah, in general, I would say that I think there's a lot of value to increasing that. And I also think that's actually something that people can do more. You know, people who are sort of, if you're feeling like, hey, there's not like I can't get involved in corporate campaigns, I can't, you know, start a plant-based meat company right now. You likely can post on social media. You can, you know, recommend that friends watch a documentary, or at least have a conversation with friends. And so I think each of those pieces is really valuable, because exactly it gets to building the social pressure and changing the culture.
Thank you. Let's go to the next question. Yeah, Shobeda.
This is actually a subset of Mubarak's question. So I do gender studies, and there's been a lot of work that's been done around the sexual politics of meat eating and the association of meat consumption with masculinity. And, you know, like when a man orders a salad, the stigma that he has to deal with, right? I think a lot of these examples are very American-centric. So maybe just to think back to your experience, if you have any interesting stories of cultural interventions around rethinking the relationship between masculinity and meat consumption that you found effective?
Yeah, it's a good point. I think there's definitely a really ingrained cultural aspect like that, and one that I think the meat industry has sort of cleverly played off. You still see a lot of ads that sort of build on that. One thing that was really interesting was the documentary The Game Changers that I alluded to briefly. It was really focused on trying to break this down by focusing on pro athletes who are plant-based, and it's always hard to say beyond that kind of Google Trends data. It's hard to show the exact impact of a documentary. But I think what's been really exciting there is seeing a lot of really prominent athletes, both male and female, endorsing that documentary, saying what an impact it had. People like Lewis Hamilton, like the Formula One star, and Chris Paul from the NBA, and other big athletes. And so, yeah, my sense is that things like that get what are the other aspects of masculinity that are being linked to meat? And I think, like, you know, protein is this big piece of it. Is really important. I mean, the other thing, maybe for sort of a more optimistic note, is that I do hope that as society slowly becomes more gender equal, you will start to see that breaking down, and you'll start to see it both being less socially acceptable for the meat industry to continue to play off gender stereotypes, but also, you know, perhaps that starts to break down some of the more kind of toxic sort of stereotypes and things at work.
Thank you for the answer. Do you have any more questions from the audience? So I'll ask another one. So the winners of the final in our competition will get to choose a charity to donate to out of the EA's most effective charities, and they will get to donate a substantial amount of money. One of the things that people have a hard time with, especially people who are new to the area, is how to compare between different fields of donations. And especially when it comes to the comparison between interventions that are supposed to increase the welfare of humans versus interventions that are supposed to increase the welfare of animals, there are people that are, you know, varying between what we only care about is the amount of suffering, and we're going to quantify suffering for an animal exactly the same as we do for a human. There are others who are going to be at the other end of the scale of say that humans are just lexically, you know, superior to animals, and therefore we should vastly care more about them. And there are some in the middle that are going to say, okay, we care about animals, but there is a degree of a discount that we're giving to the suffering of an animal. Do you mind sharing where you stand and how you think people should address this question? Because very practically, some members of our community will need to make a decision soon about how to decide between different kinds of interventions.
Yeah, it's a tough question, and one that we could probably have like a several-hour discussion on. I mean, the first thing I'd say is something I really like about being in effective altruism is I think that all the issues that I've worked on are very important and have been selected precisely because they're all issues on which you can have a lot of impact. So this should be a tough choice for people in that position, and I certainly wouldn't argue against giving to any of the other issues. I think in terms of how I think about the trade-off between animal and human well-being or suffering is that regardless of where you draw the line, you would need to have views that believe in very strong human supremacy to basically think that sufficient resources are going to animals relative to humans. And so, not to compare this necessarily to global poverty or something, because I think, again, EA issues tend to all be issues that aren't receiving enough attention. But the scale of funding for factory farming is just so much less than the scale of funding for human causes in general, and the numbers of animals involved are so much greater that you would need to believe that for most things that each human their well-being is hundreds or thousands of times more important than each individual animal. And some people will just say that's what they believe, and I suspect that's particularly true where people are thinking about, would they save the life of one human or however many animals. I think that the thing that's most relevant when it comes to well-being is to separate out what does that actually consist of. So if we have an intuition that humans are more important or their well-being matters more moment to moment, why is that? And perhaps it's, for instance, because we think humans can feel more forms of suffering than other animals. So perhaps we think that some animals, based on what we know, may not have sophisticated future reasoning, so they may not have as much suffering about the future and whether they will continue to exist or not. I think that's a valid argument. I think that I would then say, how much does that weigh versus current suffering? And do you really believe that those human forms of suffering are hundreds of times more important than the current suffering on which we seem to suffer in quite similar ways? So I think I would just encourage people to think deeply about that and to not kind of fall into the I think fallacy of just being up to sort of asserting that humans are obviously thousands of times more important, and instead saying, for this particular thing, what are the relevant forms of well-being and suffering we're talking about? Not what's the worth of a human, but how bad is it for a human to experience this kind of suffering? How bad is it for an animal to experience this kind of suffering? How many more animals could I affect? And think through it in those terms.
It's a very interesting answer. Do we have any more questions from the audience? Yeah, Amira, go ahead. You're mute.
I just unmuted. Yes, I've unmuted myself. So I guess the first part to this question was, when did you start turning over to a plant-based diet and moving away from meat? Like, where your lifetime did that happen? And secondly was, when you were doing that transition, what did you find were the most effective steps for you to eventually internalize that kind of diet? Like, were there any actual books or any websites, any steps, just everyday habits that made it more sustainable for you to make that change?
Yeah, so for me, it was a gradual process. And I think that is generally a good idea. I think that people who kind of try going plant-based overnight, it tends to be hard and tends to not be very sustainable. For myself, as I kind of learned more about factory farming as a teenager, I basically initially started trying to avoid factory farmed products. So initially I would sort of try and seek out more humane products, then realizing that things like chicken was almost always factory farmed, I would just stop eating chicken and started eating other things instead. Ultimately, I found that was just really hard and as I was saying earlier, it basically resulted in me just being a vegetarian increasingly because I almost never knew where meat came from. Ultimately, it just became easier actually to go vegetarian, which I did when I was 17. And then because I had basically the same issue with sourcing humane dairy and eggs, I went vegan when I was 18. But I do think that that process was probably quite helpful, and that it was a slow transition, and one that during that I kind of would swap things out. I mean, the nice thing now is I think there are so many resources online. Both I encourage people to kind of educate themselves on factory farming. So go watch some videos and see what things look like. And I can say from having visited factory farms that it looks really similar to what undercover investigations look like. It's basically the same. But in terms of the practical side, I think there's now just a ton of good stuff on how to cook plant-based, what to eat. So I probably, I mean, at this point, I'm just kind of set in my habits of I kind of eat my same things as long as I don't really know what the best resources are these days. But my guess is that if you just to kind of Google like how to eat plant-based and things, you probably get some great resources.
Thank you for the answer. Do you have any more questions from the audience?
Just can we get the resources from the lecture?
Yeah, so Lewis, if you don't mind, we'll place them once we upload to YouTube. We'll just place them there, and we can also send it to everyone that wants them.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, so one last thing. So as we mentioned in the intro, you work in Open Philanthropy. Some of the people who watch this may be very keen to work in Open Phil themselves. Would you mind sharing a little bit more how the day-to-day operations of Open Phil looks like, and some tips maybe for people that want to be involved specifically in Open Philanthropy in the future?
Sure. Yeah. So for kind of Phil's background, Open Philanthropy Project is the foundation of one of the Facebook co-founders and his wife, and it's dedicated to doing the most good from sort of effective altruism standpoint in improving well-being globally. I think we now have about 40 staff working across about half a dozen different major issues, and basically there are folks who are a couple of folks work in each of those programs, and then you have a number of people on the operations side supporting that. I think it's an awesome place to work in terms of having an impact, and I'd say in general that the best thing is just having a lot of flexibility and autonomy in terms of trying to direct money to have the most good. More broadly, I'd say in addition to applying to Open Philanthropy, I think something that people often overlook is the whole philanthropic sector and applying to work at other foundations, and in particular looking at foundations that are either already working on these issues and could be doing so more effectively, or who are working tangentially to issues, whether it's factory farming or global poverty or others, and where you could help bring them in to that. Obviously, there's huge kind of potential impact to be had if you can bring a major funder in a slightly better direction. So I encourage people to think about that too.
Okay, so if there are no more questions from the audience, I think here we'll conclude. So Lewis, thank you very much for a highly informative and very interesting lecture. Again, if you like the content, so please subscribe to this YouTube channel that this is going to be uploaded to. And it was a pleasure hosting you. Thank you again. Highly appreciate it.
Thank you. And thanks to everyone for your great questions.